Dr. Collins and Dr. Lander, thank you so much for being with us. I'm so thrilled to be talking with you both. I know we've talked in the past, but it's lovely to be doing it in this forum.
Great to be here. Thanks for doing it.
Of course.
Really glad to chat with you and Eric, Hallie.
I have to tell you, I know this is a topic that is near and dear to you, and I'm fascinated by it. I will say, I want to talk a lot about ARPA-H. I would be remiss in my journalistic duties if while I have the two of you esteemed doctors here, didn't ask you about the COVID pandemic. I want to do a couple of news a day questions, and then let's get into ARPA-H if that works for you. Dr. Collins, let me start with you. We're at the time now, mid-September. A lot of people looking ahead to booster shots. I know that you are a self-acknowledged, bit of a booster skeptic. As the data evolves, so did your views. Where are you on the potential for mixing and matching boosters? I know that's not the recommendation right now. Might that change when you look at shots that may come online later this fall down the road?
Well, as in all things, we want to be data-driven, and I'm happy to say NIH is running the appropriate trial right now for the 3 FDA emergency use approved vaccines. What happens if you boost with a different one than what you started with? Do you achieve the same level of neutralizing antibodies? We expect that data to be available within about a month, and that may have some significant influence. But at the moment, without that data, the recommendation is to stick with the person you came to the dance with. That is, take your booster, if you're getting one, from the same source that you got your initial immunization.
Okay.
Just to be clear, until FDA and CDC have decided about boosters for the general public, they are not yet being recommended. But if you're an immunocompromised person, you certainly are in a space to go and ask for that third dose. And ideally, you should ask for the same thing you got the first time.
We are in back to school season. As you know, so many parents got kids going to the classroom wanting to know, when are those shots? When is the vaccine going to be available for the younger cohort? Do you still think we're not likely to see that before the end of the year? Or might that be accelerating? What's your sense?
Well, the data is supposed to be fully submitted to FDA by the end of September by Pfizer. This is for kids age 5 to 11. FDA then has to look at it and see what they see as far as safety and efficacy. And we want them to look closely. Kids are not just little miniature adults. You want to be sure this is safe and effective. But I know FDA is going to pull out all the stops to do that as quickly as humanly possible. So it's possible they might be able to make a judgment on this within a month or so after getting the data, which might be as early as sort of late October. But let's just sort of keep our minds open. It's going to be probably mid to late fall or early winter, somewhere in that zone, because we don't know what the data looks like yet.
Right. And as you always say, you got to be driven by the data. Dr. Lander, I think it's fair to say there are many people who had hoped we'd be further along in the battle against the pandemic than we are right now, September here of 2021. The president has made several moves now. He had that big speech he's talking about. When it comes to the things, the initiatives that the White House and the administration is pushing, regular testing, trying to get the private sector on board, vaccine mandates, et cetera, do you hope that will be a game changer? Do you think that will happen to get people who aren't vaccinated over that line?
It's important to remember we made tremendous progress in the spring with the previous variant of COVID that was out there. It said vaccinations really work. They brought down the number of people who were susceptible, and we're doing really well. Then Delta reached our shores, and it changed the nature of the problem. So redoubling that strategy, getting a larger percentage of our population vaccinated, really getting everybody vaccinated ideally, to be able to protect them and decrease the spread. We've seen it work before. I think we now need to double down on that strategy. And, getting as many people feeling that they should go out there and get vaccinated, use all the tools at our disposal to do it, will clearly make a really significant difference.
One of the things I know that is also important to the administration, not primarily, but as part of this, is getting to the bottom of the origins of COVID. You, over the summer, joined others in calling on China to be more transparent, basically, to work more closely with the WHO in this investigation. Where are you on the most likely explanation based on what you are seeing and what you know now of the origins? Lab issue, natural origins, where are you?
Well, look, I'm a data-driven person. And right now we don't have the data that we would like to have. And I do think it would be enormously helpful if China were to open up lab notebooks and let people see what was known. I don't think that you can draw a conclusion that it came from the lab, but one would feel much better if one actually got to see the data. And frankly, I don't understand why they're just not comfortable sharing the data. Whenever an event happens like this, we as a world just want to get to the bottom of it, to understand it, to prevent future events. So I think transparency should be the watchword.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And you will have noticed, of course, when the intelligence community brought their best sleuths together to try to figure this out and produce their report after 90 days that the president had asked for, that they did not come down strongly one way or the other, although I think they tilted more in the direction of a natural origin than if there had been a lab leak. They made it very clear, however, that they agreed this is not a human bioengineered bioweapon. They couldn't rule out the possibility that it might have been under study secretly in a laboratory and escaped from there. But again, the most likely possibility from a scientific perspective, just looking at history, is that this was a natural origin. That seems to be the default in the mind of most scientists. But I wish we had better evidence from China about what really went on. And it is frustrating that they have been unwilling not to disclose more information than they have.
I see you throwing your hands up on that one too, Dr. Lynn.
Yeah, no, look, I agree with Dr. Collins completely on this. We really would love to see the data.
This topic of discussion here, right? When you think about the state of public health in this country, it is all about the pandemic. It is all about COVID. And that brings us to ARPA-H, right? How do you figure out how to use cutting edge, fast, nimble research to be able to bring solutions into the public health sphere? So let me back up for folks. I have to confess to both of you, I am a secret DARPA nerd. I think DARPA is one of the most interesting governmental entities that exist. I've always been intrigued by it. And so when I got the opportunity to talk to you two about ARPA-H, I thought, yes, this is so cool. Because it's a fascinating concept. And there are challenges to it, right? So I want to talk about both of that here. And by way of explanation, I think people watching this know probably a little bit of the broad contours of DARPA, right? Specifically intended to be this fast and nimble research operation for the Department of Defense to create new technologies, widely credited with, the internet and autonomous vehicles, and research that started some of that GPS, for example. You, along with the obviously Biden administration, are looking to create a DARPA-esque entity, ARPA-H, in order to bring that same attitude, that same culture, that same cutting-edge feel to the public health sector. So let me ask both of you, you can split this up however you'd like. Broad strokes, how do you explain ARPA to somebody who's not like a nerd like me on these kinds of things? And give me a hypothetical example. What's something that ARPA-H could work on and do that might have an impact on Americans? And Dr. Collins, I'll start with you, and then Dr. Lander, and we can go back and forth. Or Dr. Lander, start with you. No offense meant.
I'm happy to start. Francis and I will probably go back and forth with each other pretty regularly. So look, I think what's so distinctive about DARPA is they're willing to take big risks, and they work backward from what's a possible use. A lot of really important scientific research starts with curiosity about a problem and works forward to tease out how nature works. That's how we figure out how cancers come to be and how they grow. But, you want to also work back from the other end of the problem, and sometimes you want to do kind of audacious things. Build an internet to connect all information, or self-driving cars. What would that mean for health and biology? Well, here's a couple ideas. In the pandemic, we saw the power of developing vaccines, like these mRNA vaccines. Could you develop vaccines that would prevent cancers from occurring? We know cancers have distinctive mutations that pop up in many of these cancers. Could we teach your body with a vaccine to recognize those as bad news from the get-go? So when there are only a small number of cells, not even a visible number of cells that's a tumor or anything, the body would attack them. That's a pretty crazy and outrageous idea that if it turned out to work, would be really powerful. But it's hard to write an individual investigator grant to say, I want to do that. Because you have to have a lot of pieces. There are risky aspects. It'll take time. That to me is a DARPA-like project. Another one would be, suppose I wanted to take drugs and deliver them just to a specific cell type. A drug sometimes has side effects because it's doing the right thing into the target tissue, but it's doing something unhelpful or downright dangerous in other cell types. So what if I had a molecular post office that could get drugs to just the right cell type? I'd be able to increase the efficacy of many drugs. But again, trying to write an individual grant, I want to build a whole molecular post office to deliver drugs to cell types. I don't think a sensible individual investigator could write such a grant, or a sensible study section would endorse such a grant. But we want a place in the federal government where such really powerful, risky, but important ideas can be tried. And to me, it's a compliment to the rest of the amazing research system we have at the NIH and in industry. And I think it fills this important niche of things that are bold and risky, where the cost might be too high, the risk might be too big, the time frame might be too long, et cetera. So I think it's a great and exciting experiment. We have to try new approaches to really make sure that all of the opportunities we have available to us in biomedical research really get tried.
What's interesting is you don't often hear failure and healthcare like in the same sentence. But Dr. Collins, in this instance, that's actually part of it. Fail fast, move on, figure out the next thing.
You're totally right about that. And if we don't inspire the kind of innovation and risk-taking that results in a significant level of failure, then we haven't been doing the right thing with this DARPA attitude applied to health. Yeah, I'm right where Eric is in terms of the potential here. And maybe the fact that Eric and I worked together on the Human Genome Project, which was very DARPA-like in its own way, but it didn't have an easy framework to put it into the NIH at that time. I will tell you, I learned a lot in the course of the last year and a half overseeing the research on COVID-19. Let me just give you an example of something that was very much like what we want to do for ARPA-H, and that was our effort to develop new diagnostic tests that could detect the presence of the virus. We basically set up a venture capital organization as part of NIH. We had a Shark Tank where we invited those inventors who had cool ideas about viral detection to bring their ideas forward. And then we checked them out. And there was a lot of failure involved. People who were quite sure that they had the perfect technology, but it didn't scale well, or it couldn't be validated, or it couldn't actually get to a manufacturing that would reach the clinic. Out of that, though, today now, there's some 34 technology platforms that wouldn't have been there except for that. We can do that with other things. So if you want to pick an example that I'd get excited about, suppose we were to use that same approach to try to really optimize the kind of wearable sensors that can accurately measure blood pressure 24/7. We have all these people with hypertension in this country, and frankly, very few of them are probably being well managed because we don't know what's happening to their blood pressure in the middle of the night. If we knew that, we could do a much better job. There's no reason technologically we couldn't make that happen, but it would take this kind of high-risk endeavor, inviting the entrepreneurs who have ideas but maybe don't have enough resources to come forward, and let's see what they can produce.
If I can pick up on this point of Francis, this has been done in a Human Genome Project, but you had to create a whole new center and then institute at NIH to do it. Or, well, in the case of a pandemic, you could pull people together to do a diagnostics program like this. But there isn't a natural home for doing such projects. That's what we really need, is where it doesn't take some unusual thing like a genome project or fighting a pandemic, because I think there are 20 times more ideas than we're actually able to put forward, to move forward in this way.
Well, let's talk about that natural home, right? And where ARPA-H fits, Dr. Collins. As you know, there's been some criticism and some concern from experts that perhaps if it is under, NIH as it's being proposed, it's under you, it's effectively a $6.5 billion boost to your budget, that perhaps it wouldn't have the independence and the structural independence that it needs to be able to be fast and nimble and have this very different culture that both of you have talked about. So Dr. Collins, I direct this to you. How do you address those concerns? That by putting ARPA-H under your purview at NIH, that might be a problem?
Well, I've heard those concerns and I understand them. I think people are worried that this might just sort of fit into the same framework as our existing 27 institutes and centers and basically start doing business the same way with study sections and long delays in grant reviews. That is not what we are going to do. We will adopt the DARPA approach of having rapid decision making and a director of ARPA-H who has a great deal of authority in deciding what to fund, what not to fund, bringing in program managers who bring forward their ideas. It will be the DARPA model.
Term limits, sir? Program managers with these 3 to 5 year term limits like DARPA, you think?
Yes, very much like that. And so they're going to have a short timeline. The clock's going to be ticking on their dreams coming true. So they're going to be very motivated to push forward projects. We will make sure that the culture, which is a really important part of DARPA, is allowed to find a very happy home at NIH and gets insulated from any tendencies to sort of shift into more traditional modes. I know we can do that. We did this during COVID-19. I told you about that diagnostic program. We know how to do it. The benefit, of course, of having this at NIH is all of the ways in which there is going to be scientific exchange of ideas and information. If you put this somewhere else in the government, you would miss that, and it would probably take a long time to stand it up as well. We could incubate the stand-up process, but not interfere with the independence. But Eric, you should talk about this too.
Yeah, well, let me talk just a little bit about it. Look, the director of ARPA-H can't be told what to do by the director of the NIH. In fact, all of the decisions are up to the director of that unit. That's actually technically true about all the institutes and centers. They make their decisions about funding. Francis doesn't tell them what to do. I think what we have to do is make sure that we hire somebody who comes from a totally different direction, somebody who comes from a more DARPA-like direction, and is going to bring this idea of, well, a very different kind of review. At a typical study section, grants get ranked numerically and get funded in some order. What happens at DARPA is projects get reviewed on a yay or nay basis. Is this worth doing or not? And then this highly empowered program manager, she gets to decide what portfolio to assemble out of those pieces and drives them and looks for fast failures and pushing things. If we do not bring a DARPA-like culture to ARPA-H, there's no point in doing it. And we have said this from the beginning. I'm in favor of this experiment if it looks different than the rest of NIH, because it'll be a great complement. If we were to just reproduce what's already there, which is great, don't mind, I don't want to disagree in any way about how great it is, but the point here is do something very different. There's a great model, and I think we want to carry that model over and see what it can do in biology. I'm committed to that. I know Francis is committed to that. And I know the president is committed to that because he wants to see us be able to push the frontiers of this with speed and risk-taking.
You talk about speed, Dr. Lander. Explain to a layman, right? Somebody who's not versed in this constantly. The projects that are created inside ARPA-H don't get to skip the typical regulatory processes, right? They still have to be safe and effective and be proven to be safe. So how fast can you really go while still assuring Americans that whatever tech or therapeutics or treatments come out of ARPA-H, are still going to make you okay? They're still
What
safe.
a great question. That's a fabulous question. Let's separate the two parts. The part where you can go fast is on developing ideas and seeing if they might work. The part where you have to go at what you would say is normal speed is on regulatory evaluation of safety. That is not the part to speed up. But, testing this idea, could we make molecular zip codes to deliver to different cell types? In a traditional way, you might go one cell type at a time on the research bench, testing this and testing that. Maybe you should set up a parallel test with hundreds of different cell types, seeing what could work, making that telescope to be 10 times faster, and then that'll generate things that have to go into a regulatory process. Before you put anything into a human being, you have to proceed very carefully at the regulatory stage. But while you're at this experimental discovery stage of creating new technological platforms, I say move at fast speeds there. And then, as you say, very careful when you actually turn it into a therapy. But for a lot of these things, we're talking about building platforms that might be used for a dozen different diseases, enabling tools. And that, I do think there's enormous opportunities to accelerate.
Yeah, let me give another example because it's a really important area of emphasis that I think ARPA-H ought to focus on, which is health inequities, because that is such a major challenge for the way in which our healthcare system operates or sometimes doesn't operate very effectively or very fairly. Imagine that you could form a project around the idea of community health workers, which is something done sometimes in other countries, often in low and middle income countries, but never really tried at scale in the US. Try a significant pilot where you offer community health workers in communities that are very heavily afflicted with health disparities, common illnesses, to try to prevent those illnesses and try to figure out how best to manage them by having community health workers who directly interact with patients in their homes, in their communities, to try to be sure the right advice is offered and acted upon. There's a fair chance that this could be one of our best efforts to actually reduce illness in those communities, and yet we've never really tried it out. So you'd want to set that up. You'd want to get it going quickly. You'd want to have it overseen carefully to see if it looked like it was working. But if it looked like it was, then the next step, which isn't exactly regulation, it's reimbursement, would be to convince third-party payers, beginning with CMS, that this is something they'd want to pay for because in the long term, it's going to save money. So like Eric said, sort of dividing up the research question, doing that really nimbly, not being afraid of risk. But then once you get an answer, if it's an encouraging answer, then you go into that step of regulation and reimbursement.
I'm glad you brought up equity, Dr. Collins, because that is such a critical part of this. And I know it's important that both of you have talked about it, have written about it, that you want equity to be built into the DNA, if you will, of every project, right? That it's got to be part of the design of the projects that ARPA-H takes on. But I ask you, and Dr. Lehner, maybe you can take this to start, how do you guarantee that that's more than just lip service? How do you make sure that ARPA-H will really do that? Will you, push it to focus more research on issues that affect underprivileged communities, for example? How do you do it?
There are multiple ways. You start with the people you hire, because unless you have a really diverse set of people around the table, then you're not going to do it. And so when DARPA might hire 100 program managers to take on defense applications, well, I don't know, maybe when DARPA started in the 50s and 60s and 70s, I feel pretty secure saying it was not a particularly diverse group. I think when ARPA-H starts, this has to be a group of program managers who are coming with passion for a variety of different problems. They have to understand the full range of problems that face America, from the molecular to the societal, and be able to range across that. So we ought to be able to tell in year one that the people who are coming as program managers represent that range of Americans and that range of interests. And then you've actually got to look at that portfolio each year. If the portfolio was all at the molecular level, you would say, why aren't we running experiments at, frankly, what might be the even harder level? Societal challenges are harder, and yet we ought to approach them with this same risk-taking experimental approach of what could work to make a difference for people and in different communities. So I don't think it's going to be very hard to tell by year two that this thing has diverse people, diverse thinking, and diverse projects. And if it doesn't, I and Francis and others certainly would be objecting already and saying we're not doing what we're doing. And then the last thing I'd say is the performers, the groups actually doing the projects, they too have to bring the real range of diversity in the country. So lip service isn't going to do. There are real measurable observables very early in this, and we ought to hold ourselves to it, because I think this equity question is so critical, because we know that we have inequitable outcomes across so many things, and we need to figure out how to address it, and address it soon.
Totally agree. Well said.
a plus one added to that from you, Dr. Collins. Let me ask you, and I think it's an important conversation to have, so thank you for that, Dr. Lander. Dr. Collins, let me ask you about this, because one big difference, right, with DARPA, it has really one customer, and that's the Defense Department. ARPA-H is very different, right? And I know that there has been research done that shows that even at DARPA, there are some barriers getting it from sort of the research phase to then acquisition and use, right? You got to imagine those barriers will only be exacerbated given the difference between the health and defense sectors when it comes to ARPA-H. How do you overcome that? Will there be something similar to, for example, ARPA-E, where you're asking those involved in projects to be thinking about commercialization from the beginning? Talk through how you connect the dots, if you will.
Hallie, that's another really good question. And we're already thinking hard about that, because if you haven't considered the commercialization potential of a program that aims to get a product to the public eventually, if you haven't done that right from the beginning, then you're likely to make a profound mistake, where you make a big investment and then something basically sits there because there's something about it that's really never going to find its way into a commercial product. So we would expect the way in which projects are pitched and evaluated to have that as part of the consideration. You know, about the Heil-Meyer catechism, the questions that get asked traditionally at DARPA about any project that's being put forward. Well, this has got to be baked into that. If a program manager is pitching a project to the director and doesn't have a good answer about the commercialization potential of something that's supposed to benefit the public, then that project really is not ready for prime time. You're totally right. That can't be an afterthought. That's got to be right up front.
Yep. So the Heil-Meyer Catechism is these list of maybe 10 questions that one of the early DARPA directors posed to every single problem. And one of them is, if you're successful, what difference will it make? And if you can't connect the dots, I mean, it's possible to fail. It's okay to fail. But if you're successful, you got to tell me it's going to make a difference in the world. That's what we need to be thinking about from the beginning, because if you don't organize the project so that you've got all those pieces thought about, it could take a decade extra to get something out.
So you're still in the, listen, you're still in the process of hoping to stand up ARPA-H, right? But get in your time machines with me, which may be another DARPA project one day, and let's flash forward 5 years, 10 years, right? What are the, I want to be more specific than asking about what does success look like, because it could look like a lot of things. What are the metrics? How are you measuring what success is in, let's say, 5 years? Let's say 5 years, that's a shorter timeline and want to be fast with ARPA-H. What are the metrics that you're using to measure that? I'd like to hear from both of you on that.
Francis, you want to start?
Okay. So obviously 5 years should be enough time to have actually initiated hundreds of projects. We expect to hire, maybe in the first year, 100 program managers, and they will, on the average, have more than one project that they're interested in pursuing. So there'll be a lot to work with here. Again, one of the metrics will be failure rate. If it's 10%, we got a big problem. It should be more like 60 or 70%, or we're not being risky enough. So there's a failure metric, which some people think should be low. We think should probably be high in this circumstance. But also, how quickly did you fail? Let's not have things drag out and spend a lot of money that you could have predicted we're actually not going to make it. But then, are you interested in the successes? So that would be sort of ticking off. What is it that the projects that were supported have done to actually produce a change in the way in which we prevent, treat, or cure disease? Because that is what we're aiming to do. And are those projects things that otherwise wouldn't have happened or would not have happened in that space of time? That's going to be, I think, a pretty good spreadsheet that you're going to put forward, looking to see how that plays out. And commercialization will be part of that as well. It can't be that we published a bunch of papers, which is oftentimes the way biomedical research evaluates itself. There will be papers published, and I hope they will be wonderful and get highly cited. But the real goal here, this is supposed to be use-driven, not curiosity-driven, as Eric said earlier. Use-driven means there need to be uses that come out of this, and we will want to tally those up.
Yep, and I look out 5 years from now, there better be a list of things where we say, boy, that would have never been funded, never would have happened under standard mechanisms. If these things are all things that could have happened otherwise, what's the point? And then there better be a whole lot of things that have lit the fires of imagination across a field. There'll be things of the sort, oh, I never thought we could do anything like this. And it'll give rise to 30 startups because it'll crack open a problem that nobody could get the critical mass to answer. It might be a problem about Alzheimer's, a problem in cancer, but those demonstrations that something's possible, like an internet or an mRNA vaccine or whatever, those things are not often a single product. They are the start of an entire field. And we ought to see within 5 years some of those things, blossoming even before these projects are finished, because people are going to be looking at them and saying, oh, something new is now on the horizon. I want to get with it.
We have less than a minute left, and I want to end by asking each of you to answer 2 questions in 1 sentence each. First question is, what is your pitch to the talent you want to recruit to ARPA-H in a sentence? Second question, what do Americans need to know about this? What is your message to America about this potential project here? I'm going to put you on the spot, Dr. Lander, to go first. 1 sentence on your message to the talent, 1 sentence on your message to the
Well, to the talent, what could be more exciting than to take risks on the single most important thing we can do today, which is transform health? Come do it. What would be the message to Americans? This is a special moment in biomedical science, which has given us tools to go beyond what we would have even imagined 10 years ago. And we have a moral obligation to seize this moment. Join us, back us. It will transform in ways we cannot imagine today.
There might have been 4 sentences, Dr. Lander. I'll let you get away with it.
There were semicolons in there.
Dr. Collins, same 2 questions to you to wrap us up.
To the people applying to work on this, I would say if you are an entrepreneurial, visionary dreamer, these are going to be the best jobs in biomedical research in the world for several decades. To the American public, I would say, we are at this remarkable inflection point of scientific advances, unlike anything that's happened in human history, and ARPA-H is the way to capitalize on those opportunities to bring benefits to the public at least twice as fast than they would otherwise happen.
I'm so fortunate to be able to have had this conversation with both of you, Dr. Collins, Dr. Lander. Thank you both so much. It is fascinating, and I look forward to talking with you both more about this down the road.
Thank you.
Hallie.